Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The executive director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I thank you so much for your willingness to give us a portion of your valuable day. I'm sure you know that there are a couple of important elections going on today, the one in Virginia, the one in New Jersey being the two that I'm referring to, the Chris Christie election in New Jersey, and of course the heated election in Virginia between the Attorney General Cuccinelli, who is supported by the Tea Party, versus Terry McAuliffe, who is a well-known name in Democratic political circles, who was a key advisor in the Clinton administration, and obviously, the whole nation is watching these two elections very, very, very carefully and very closely. In fact, I wanted to begin today by addressing an issue that has come up in the Virginia election. But before we do that, I just wanted to again thank you for your willingness to spend some time with us today as we talk about a number of issues related to the Constitution of the United States, its meaning, its implications, its ramifications, and whatever. And yesterday, if you were with us, you know that we spent the second hour of our program. Well, actually, we spent the entire program, because the first hour we spent going back over, looking once again at Federalist Number 1, the very first of the Federalist Papers, Hamilton's introduction to the series, which was going to total 85 individual separate pieces that appeared in the New York newspapers in 1787, 1788, urging ratification of the Constitution. Then in our second hour, we looked at Federalist Number 39, which was written by James Madison, and in that particular paper, Madison addressed the issue of Republican government, the whole idea of republicanism, and his basic challenge was that the opponents of the Constitution, the anti-federalists, were suggesting that ratification of were arguing, not suggesting, they were saying that ratification of the Constitution would effectively destroy Republican government in America and replace it with something approaching a government with, with dictatorial powers, and it would destroy the states and destroy the power of the states and to destroy the validity and the vitality of the states. And so Madison had set out in a number of these Federalist Papers to take on many of these challenges and many of these criticisms of the Constitution. And the one that we looked at yesterday, number 39, was based on charges that the Constitution of the United States was inconsistent with, was contradictory to the whole idea of republicanism, and to ratify the Constitution was to destroy republicanism. And we spent the second hour yesterday looking at that. What I had proposed today was that we look at several Federalist Papers beyond that, dealing with the whole idea of separation of powers and the consistency of the Constitution with the ideas of Montesquieu. Montesquieu not only basically is the so-called guru, the font of wisdom, if you will, when it comes to 18th century attitudes and views towards Republican government, but his spirit of the laws is considered to be the classic definition of the idea of separation of powers, the idea that government functions must be divided into separate branches of government, and the idea being that the extent to which power bleeds from one branch of government into the other one, which suggests that the same people can exercise power in a number of different venues is a violation of the whole principle of limited government and an invitation to tyranny. And so that becomes a major challenge for Madison and the Federalists authors of the Federalist Papers, is to take on that allegation as well. Madison does that beginning in Federalist number 47. It's continued in 48, 49, 50, and then finally he concludes his address on this issue with number 51, which we've already looked at a number of weeks ago here at the Virtual Center, where Madison returns to the principles that he outlined in Federalist number 10 about enlarging the sphere and setting up a government that can regulate the effects of factionalism and all the rest of it. So my point here is to not only kind of review a little bit of what we talked about yesterday, but also to make the point that we are not, this program is not called the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility for nothing. That in effect, when you are into the midst of the Federalist Papers, you are probably as far into the Constitution of the United States in terms of its meaning and its intent and what the founders were about as you can possibly get. So, you know, I think this kind of is right in our wheelhouse, as it were. It's where we belong, and I think where we need to continue to come back and touch base with the Constitution in order to make sure that we don't end up getting too far afield. We have a phone number. We would love to hear from you. It's wonderful that you have chosen to tune in and to listen. We hope that you will be a much more active participant than that. We hope that you will feel comfortable, if inclined, to participate in the program actively by giving us a call and sharing your ideas, your thoughts, your opinions, your reactions, suggestions, criticisms, considerations, whatever word is most appropriate. We would love to hear from you. I have talked before, and I don't want to spend any time on it, but I do want you to not feel at all inhibited by going on the air. I know a lot of people won't do it. In fact, I've talked to people who said they would never do it. But it seems like at some point in time, many of these same people will find it irresistible, especially if they're used to listening and they're used to hearing other people make their views heard, and then the topic of conversation happens to get to a subject that they feel really strongly about. And more often than not, it's an irresistible urge to basically express oneself, especially if the topic at hand is one that you've thought about, that you feel strongly about, that perhaps you've read about, you've thought about, you've spent a lot of time reflecting on it, or whatever. And I want you to feel comfortable doing that. And I want you to know that not only I, but other members of our listening audience here at the Virtual Center, and those generally who we can consider part of the head-on family, the Horn family, are very, very interested in your opinions and your points of view. The mere fact that you are a listener to the Horn, generally, and to this particular program especially, is an indication that you are a certain kind of person, a different kind of person, a person that wants to know, that wants to think, and does think, and does reflect, and does read, and does consider alternative points of view, and the mere fact that you are tuned in says that pretty much defines you. And so that in itself, it seems to me, is evidence enough of the fact that what you would have to offer is something that not only I, as I mentioned, but other listeners as well would be more than interested in hearing and listening to and thinking about and reacting to. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. If you feel more comfortable reacting directly with me via email, then I would love to hear from you. And I know it takes time, I know it takes effort, and I appreciate that very much. And if you do email me, I'll do the very best I can do to respond. My email address is waobrien906 at gmail.com. That's waobrien906 at gmail.com. It is so interesting that in the history class that I am teaching in this area on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I have the class at 10 o'clock in the morning, the second meeting this week. We are into the early 19th century, and we have just had an exam, and we're beginning our move towards the last third of the course, which is the onset of the Civil War and the process of the Civil War itself. What we've been looking at in the early 19th century are some of the major changes and major transitions that occur as the nation moves from the late 19th century, from the administrations of George Washington and John Adams in the 1790s, to the early 19th century administrations of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and then John Quincy Adams in 1824, and of course in 1828 the election of Andrew Jackson. And our second exam in the course that I'm teaching was basically focused principally on this period, on the post-independence period, the Confederation period, the Constitution, ratification of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Washington administration, the Jefferson administration, etc. And that's what we had our exam based our exam on. But the point was we were talking in class on Monday, on Friday, because we had our exam on Monday, about these issues. And one of the things that becomes very clear is that right out of the chute, from the very beginning, from the Washington administration, from the appointment of Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, there's discord and disharmony within the Washington administration almost right away. As Hamilton seizes the initiative at the beck and call of the President and the Congress requests Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton to bring it recommendations on a financial program that would get the American economy and the American economic system up and running. And you know, most of us know this from our grade school textbooks. And Hamilton responds with a series of public reports. A report on the public credit, a report on manufacturing, a report on trade and commerce, and a report on the need for a United States bank. And each of these reports gives rise to a particular part of Hamilton's financial program introduced in the early 1790s, and we talked about this program here at the Virtual Center before. It is a system designed, at least on the surface, to generate economic growth and economic development in America. It's a classic example of a government-initiated, government-controlled body of suggested legislation, the purpose of which is to generate the kinds of entrepreneurial and economic activity in the nation which, if successful, is going to promote economic growth in America and economic power and political power in relations with other countries of the world. In other words, the idea is that if the American economy does indeed grow, and if America is able to build up not only its commercial capabilities, but its manufacturing capabilities as well, if the new nation is able to stabilize its economy, stabilize its credit, stabilize the value of currency, establish a national banking system, and in the process, do everything that is necessary to use government's taxing power to promote manufacturing in America by imposing high protective tariffs on foreign imports. The sum total of all these things becomes a model for economic growth and development in America. We talked about this, and we talked about the extent to which the program, by its, in its very essence, appears to be sectional and divisive. It's very obvious, for example, that sector of the economy which is the weakest in America is the manufacturing sector, as well as the economic sector. And that's for obvious reasons, because as colonies of Great Britain, these colonies were denied the opportunity to develop these capabilities into strength. The idea was that the whole management of the empire from the mother country's point of view was that the empire and its colonies needed to be managed in such a way that all the benefits and all the wealth and all the natural resources, all the things that colonies would contribute to a nation's growth, expansion, and power ought to happen in the mother country. And so the colonies were forbidden the right to print money. The colonies were forbidden the right to trade with anybody else but England. These were the Navigation Acts and all those other things that England opposed through the colonial period. And the mother country, Parliament, passed specific pieces of legislation forbidding the colonies to do any manufacturing. Their job was to generate the exploitation of raw materials and the shipping of those raw materials to the mother country, where they would be processed into finished goods for sale. And then theoretically, not just sold to other nations throughout Europe, but also sold back to the colonists themselves. So the idea was that the colony's role is not to manufacture and compete with the mother country, but to generate the kind of raw materials which allow the mother country to develop its manufacturing capability and its expansion and growth. And the result of this, of course, would be strength for the entire empire. By definition, then, if the mother country's trade, this is the whole idea of buying and selling, trade and commerce, if the whole idea commercially is not only built as, well, if the whole idea is not to just build up manufacturing, but also commercially to establish a favorable balance of trade in the mother country. In other words, the success would be that the mother country is selling more than it's buying. What that suggests is more competitors, more potential competitors are more dependent on what you are selling than you are on what they're selling. And that turned out to be a way to measure dependency, i.e. power or lack thereof. If you are too dependent on others for what you need, you are vulnerable and weak. On the other hand, if others are buying from you what they don't have, then that suggests that they are dependent and weak, and on the contrary, you are independent and powerful. So the reality of the relationship between mother country and colonies, by definition, must be that if the mother country is independent and powerful, then by definition the colonies cannot be. The colonies must be dependent and therefore dependent upon the mother country and not independently powerful in and of themselves. If the mother country is going to have a favorable balance of trade, if the mother country is going to sell more than it needs to buy, then by definition the colonies cannot have a favorable balance of trade. Their balance must be unfavorable by definition. If the mother country must sell more than it buys, then by definition the colonies must buy more than they sell. That makes sense. And so therefore Parliament passes specific pieces of legislation like the Had Act in the 1750s and the Iron Act in 1740, forbidding the colonies to process raw materials, to process ore into finished iron, to process fur and pelts into hats. The idea is that you send the raw material to the mother country, and all the manufacturing, all the jobs are gleaned there. And so, that's kind of what we were talking about. So consequently, when the colonies become states, when America is successful in achieving its independence from the mother country, then by definition there are certain sectors of the American economy that need support, that need strengthening, because the mother country intentionally kept them weak. One of them is financial, and the other one is manufacturing. So Hamilton's program addresses those two weaknesses with a protective tariff designed to promote American manufacturing and a bank bill designed to stabilize the economy and provide a resource for credit to new businesses, to business startups. And the idea being that government must be an active player in the economic growth and development of the nation. And by definition, because these policies appear to be sectional, they appear to favor New England, they appear to favor the large cities of the North and the middle colonies rather than the agricultural areas of the West or the plantation areas of the South. Not only do they appear to be, in fact they do, then consequently opposition to them emerges both in the South and in the West. And this opposition is quickly recognized and organized by Madison and Jefferson into what becomes an emerging alternative political party in America, the Jeffersonian Republicans. And after 4 years of John Adams's presidency in the late 1790s, the Jeffersonian Republicans are able to seize the White House in what Thomas Jefferson referred to as a revolution, the Revolution of 1800. And the basis for him calling it a revolution was that this is the first time in the history of modern nations that power has been transferred from one party to another peacefully. And then the Jeffersonians come into power. But what the point that I wanted to make here, and I don't want to go into more detail on this stuff than is necessary. The point that I wanted to make is that now that the Republicans are in power, it doesn't take long before they begin to realize the wisdom of Hamilton's program. And so the very party that came into existence opposing banks and credit and funding programs and a vibrant, aggressive, large, visible national government that is directly involved in the promotion of economic growth, the party that came into existence in opposition to all those things, by the time the War of 1812 ends in 1815, the Republicans begin to enact a nationalist program of economic development that is very, very consistent with Hamilton's. Madison, Monroe, and the rest of them, and of course at this time the Secretary, Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury is Albert Gallatin. They begin to realize very quickly that there was wisdom in Hamilton's thinking. And it was a mistake to let the Bank of the United States that Hamilton created expire, let the charter expire in 1811. So coming out of the War of 1812, Madison proposes the creation of a second United States bank. And they propose a protective tariff. And they propose what they call internal improvements, which is government sponsorship of roads and canals and bridges and ultimately railroads, a very aggressive policy of economic development and infrastructure throughout an expanding, growing nation. the point I'm making is that when government enacts a series of policies that a particular part of the nation finds offensive, what you begin to see is those on the defensive will begin to challenge the legitimacy of these powers, of the government's power to do these things. Madison challenged the legality, the constitutionality of the bank, if you remember, on the basis of strict construction. Hamilton argued that the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution gave government the power to do whatever it needed to do to carry out its delegated powers. And so the mere fact that government had been given the power to regulate commerce and to tax, Hamilton argued, implied the power of government to create a bank, to charter a bank. And that is accepted, and later, when it is brought to the Supreme Court in 1819, in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, John Marshall, the Chief Justice, speaks for a unanimous court when he subscribes to the position that Hamilton had taken so many years earlier, 30 years earlier. The idea that the necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution indeed did give the government the power to charter the bank. It was implied. And, you know, we've been through a lot of this before. The point I wanted to make is that there seems to be a tradition in America that when you don't like what government is doing, there's a tendency to fall back on the same arguments and the same positions that were tried before. The reason I'm saying this is because, and I'm back to the very beginning of a program today when we made reference to the Virginia election that's underway today as we speak. On Monday evening in Richmond, Virginia, the Republican candidate, the so-called Tea Party candidate, Cuccinelli, had a final rally in downtown Richmond at the Richmond Convention Center. I've mentioned before that I lived for 16 years in Richmond, Virginia, so I know Richmond quite well. I know the convention center and all. I can just see this happening. But in order to support his campaign, he brought in heavy hitters from around the country to support his campaign. And one of them was Ron Paul. And of course, I know the one we're hearing all the time now about Rand Paul, his son, who's the Rand Paul is involved in a in a give and take with Rachel Maddow on the fact that he plagiarized a number of his speeches from Wikipedia, and that's kind of an ongoing thing that's happening right now as well. We haven't heard much from Ron Paul since the last election, when he was in the campaign and appeared in many of these debates prior to the last election. Ron Paul's 78 years old. He retired from Congress in 2012, and so he's not been heard of that much. But he made a trip to Richmond, Virginia Monday night in order to support the Cuccinelli campaign. And in his speech in Richmond on Monday evening, Ron Paul suggested the nullification of Obamacare. Nullification. Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. John C. Calhoun and nullification. If you remember, John C. Calhoun wrote the position paper for South Carolina's nullification of the Tariff of Abominations of 1824 and 1828, the so-called Tariff of Abominations. Calhoun was the architect of the idea, the theory of nullification. All of us in our school books have touched upon this. I would suggest to you, however, that we fought a civil war to bring some of these issues to a head and settle them. But it's very obvious that what's happening right now, Ron Paul's speech Monday night indicates that arguments in support of the idea of nullification continue to live and thrive in the South and in the Tea Party, in American politics today. Ron Paul said in his speech, Jefferson obviously was a clear leader on the principle of nullification. I've been working on the assumption that nullification is going to come. It's going to be a de facto nullification. It's ugly, but pretty soon things are going to get so bad that we're just going to ignore the feds and live our own lives in our own states. Nullification obviously is a loaded word, especially in Richmond, Virginia. Because, and I'll just make a comment that in the years I lived there are many people in that area that really feel like the Civil War didn't really end. It's just kind of between the second and third period. You know what I'm saying? It's between periods. The bands are on the field marching while the teams are back in the dressing rooms getting ready for the third and final period. They believed that that none of these things were really settled. They were just postponed temporarily. And it is frightening that Ron Paul and Cuccinelli and these people would resort to the very word nullification in this day and age, given the explosiveness of that concept, especially in the place where they are speaking. I thought, given that we really ought to spend a little bit of time here today at the Virtual Center talking about the issue of nullification, trying to get our arms around it and to get a handle on what exactly it means, and looking at some of the more classic examples of when it was used. Because one of the things that Ron Paul is right about, Jefferson obviously was a clear leader on the principle of nullification. Jefferson was the author of the Kentucky Resolutions in 1798. And so this calls for a little bit of background, a little bit of history. Many of you will remember that during the Adams administration in the 1790s, the Republican Party and the Federalists, which had come into existence in opposition to Hamilton's program, I think that's generally accepted by most historians. There's no question that what really brought substance and institutionalization and validity to the two-party system as much as anything else was their differing position on foreign policy. France and England were at war. France naturally assumed that it could depend on the United States for support in its war against England for two reasons. One obviously is that we had just fought a war against England for our own independence. So they had very recently been our enemy, our arch enemy. But the second reason is that France during that struggle for independence had been our friend. And in 1778, the colonies were able to negotiate an alliance with France. Many historians, military historians, believe that if it hadn't been for the French alliance, if it hadn't been for the support that the colonies received from France, they probably would have not been successful in their quest for independence from the mother country. Even though the government of France in the 1790s is a different government, the fact of the matter is France logically assumes that the alliance of 1778 is still in force. France has resumed its war with Great Britain, and the assumption is that the Americans are still with us. We were with them when they were fighting Great Britain. And that was what the alliance said. We'll support you, you support us. And so the two-party system really begins to solidify and divide and become much more easily defined around the issue of foreign policy. Because the Federalists, Alexander Hamilton being the leading one, recognized that long-term America's future lies with good relations with Great Britain, because that's what he's talking about is an economic future. Because Britain was the major commercial power in the world and the empire was worldwide, then positive, good relationships with Great Britain would guarantee us access to a commercial network, to a commercial empire, which would be to our advantage. So Hamilton felt that the best long-term interests of America, of the United States, would have maintained positive relations with Great Britain rather than France. France couldn't do anything for us anymore. Not only that, but in the 1790s, in 1789, the French Revolution happened. And many people throughout the world are appalled at the course that the French Revolution took by the early 1790s as what was a revolution that Jefferson and many Americans were able to support deteriorated very quickly in the 90s into a horrendous situation of terror and execution and the guillotine and the execution of the king and other crimes against humanity, which suggests that the worst evils of human nature were calling the shots in France. And so to be a supporter of France during this period at the height of the French Revolution, to Hamilton and the other Federalists, was the equivalent of treason. It was not only stupid, it was potentially treasonable. So consequently, the two parties began to divide much more rigidly and became much more clearly defined around the issue of foreign policy, specifically the war between France and Great Britain. And as logic would suggest, both France and Great Britain were not above playing us off one against the other. And it would take pretty sharp, pretty astute foreign policy experts to navigate your way through this very, very complicated and potentially dangerous diplomatic morass, which was the war between Great Britain and France. And history shows us that neither Jefferson nor Madison was very good in terms of diplomacy. In fact, one textbook that, the textbook we're using in the class, the course that I'm teaching, makes the point that Madison, when he became president after the election of 1808, after Jefferson left office, Madison seemed to make one foreign policy blunder after another. This is the same James Madison who was the architect of the Constitution and the person who wrote Federalist Number 10, Federalist Number 39, Federalist Number 51, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But he wasn't good at everything. And one of the things he wasn't good at was foreign policy. And both he and Jefferson were committed to an idea that there were so many dangers associated with becoming too involved with Great Britain and too committed to the idea of manufacturing, that they were trying to make the best of what we had, which is a very strong, viable commercial agricultural component capability. Jefferson and Madison both believed that if the nations of Europe became dependent upon the United States for agricultural products, for our agricultural strength and prowess, then that dependency would give us leverage. We would not be weak without the ability to manufacture. We would be strong as long as these nations were dependent upon us. So both Jefferson and Madison tried to threaten both England and France with boycotts and embargoes, threatening to shut down, to shut off the supply of American agriculture in order to win concessions in foreign policy. And that, for the masters of foreign policy that existed in both Great Britain and France, this made the United States very vulnerable, and many of these policies, like Jefferson's embargo, backfired. But I defer. I'm a little bit off course here. So what happens in the 1790s then is that the party in power, which is the Federalists, and of course their president is John Adams, are able to push through Congress a series of restrictive legislation that pretty much is defined by the situation at hand, the so-called Alien and Sedition Acts. And there are 4 specific pieces of legislation, all of them designed to silence the Republican Party and silence Republican support for France in this war with Great Britain. And it's very, very clear to many people that we are very close to going to war with France because of what France is doing based on its belief that the Alliance of 78 is still in force and many other things. And it's only John Adams and his last-ditch effort to try to avoid war that's able to pull off a peace. But the fact of the matter is the Alien and Sedition Acts, which clearly violate First Amendment freedoms of press, freedoms of speech, freedoms of assembly, clearly these are unconstitutional pieces of legislation, give rise to opposition among the Republican Party. Jefferson and Madison author the so-called Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Madison offers the Virginia resolutions and gets it through the legislature of Virginia. Jefferson writes the Kentucky resolutions that go through the legislature of Kentucky. And both of these positions, both of these resolutions, introduce the idea of nullification. The idea that the nation is a compact of independent states, and that it is naive to assume that the government of the United States, or even one branch of the government of the United States, which is the courts, the Supreme Court, would have the power to determine how much power that same government would have. In other words, their argument was it was insane to believe that the founders intended that a government that derived power from the Constitution would be the judge of exactly how much power it had. Their conclusion is that that decision remained with the states. That the only protection that the people had from an abusive, dictatorial, tyrannical central government was the protection of their state governments. And so therefore, the state governments, according to this theory, retained the right to determine the constitutionality of what the federal government was doing. And 2 words come up in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And the first one is interposition. The idea of interposition. And the second one, of course, is nullification. And basically, the principles that they argue for are first interposition. That they argue that the state governments retain the right to interpose themselves that's the word interposition, to interpose themselves between the federal government and the people of their state. In other words, what they are arguing for is the right of the state to inject itself between the federal government and the people of that state, because the people of that state created that state government legitimately by compact, and that state is the entity responsible for the protection of the people's rights. And so consequently, the state government should have the power of interposition. So if Congress is doing something, is passing laws that the people feel are beyond its legitimate power, are unconstitutional, like the Alien and Sedition Acts, then the state would have a right to get between the government and the national government and the people in order to prevent the national government from directly enforcing those acts on its citizens. But interposition was only temporary, and if the situation continued, if it was not resolved, then ultimately it was up to the states to rule on the constitutionality, on the legality of what the federal government is doing. And if the state government felt that the federal government was abusing its power or abusing its rights under the Constitution, then the state had the power to nullify that law within that state. In other words, to declare that particular law null and void within the state of Virginia or Pennsylvania or Massachusetts or Vermont or whatever state you're talking about. So the two basic principles are interposition and nullification, and they become the basis of an argument for states' rights under the Constitution of the United States. And the fact that Madison and Jefferson are the architects of these two resolutions obviously is very significant, since Madison was the author of the Constitution of the United States and the leading architect of the case being made to get it ratified. There's absolutely no question that while Hamilton wrote most of the Federalist Papers in the New York ratification situation, Madison's contribution to the overall success of ratification of the Constitution in most of the states was critical. Hamilton's was only visible in New York. Madison's was critical in any number of states. And so how do you explain the apparent inconsistency between Madison's position in Federalist Number 10 and his position as author of the Virginia Resolutions in 1798 in opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts? Historians have been playing with that one for a long time. One conclusion is that Madison's position in support of individual rights of freedom, individual freedom, liberty, which was so evident in Federalist Number 10. If you remember, he said there are two ways to eliminate the violence of factions. One is to take away people's liberty, take away people's freedom to belong to them. And Madison says that, the cure is worse than the disease. And then he makes the analogy about air and fire. And he said you don't abolish air because it feeds fire. Consequently, you do not take away man's freedom because they might abuse it. And so many people believe that Madison's commitment to individual freedom is the link between the Virginia Resolution and Federalist Number 10. But the point is that these architects Madison being the architect of the Constitution, but also Jefferson, they resort to the idea of nullification and interposition as the philosophical basis of states' rights. This is the only legitimate way that they feel that the states can somehow find a way to object to policies and programs coming out of the federal government that they feel violate their rights or are unconstitutional or unfair or whatever you want to call it. So Ron Paul is right. Jefferson is one of the architects of the principle of nullification. But I would suggest to you that the Civil War pretty much took care of nullification. It should have. And the fact that the Ron Pauls and Cuccinellis of the world are resorting to it today in the area of Obamacare is a classic example of going back and resurrecting the same arguments and the same positions that were used years and years past when the situation is the same. We continue to go back over and over again and conjure up the same arguments and the same positions and the same rationalizations. And I think it's significant. And most people will associate the idea of nullification with Calhoun and the South prior to the Civil War. And they tend to forget that nullification, the first major use of the term, was by James Madison and by Thomas Jefferson in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. But let me suggest something else that's often overlooked. Most people know that while Madison is president in 1808, the United States begins to drift uncontrollably into what becomes another war with Great Britain, the so-called War of 1812. And there's a lot written about that war, and we won't go into. I'm not going to go into the war itself, but if you look at the circumstances at the time, it's very obvious that the United States had no business going to war in 1812. We didn't have the army, we didn't have the money. The economy was not suitable to support or fund a war. Of course, we found out with Iraq that you can just put it on your credit card. And so, it was really kind of stupid in a lot of ways to allow the nation to drift into war. Many people believe that more than any other war in America's history, the War of 1812 was based on poor communications, the inability to communicate. For example, the last battle of the war, the most famous one is the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, which many of you may know happened after the peace treaty had been signed ending the war. It was about a week after that, and word hadn't gotten there quickly enough, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot about the War of 1812 that's interesting, but what a lot of people miss is the fact that even though the cause of the war was Britain's policies on the high seas, its seizure of American ships, its imprisonment of American seamen, taking seamen off the ships and putting them in cells, and basically, in a sense, impressing them into the British Navy, if they could. In other words, violations of America's neutral rights on the high seas was the justification, major justification for the war. Their interference with our shipping, their interference with our trade, their refusal to respect the United States and the United States, our access to the seas and all of this other stuff. But the fact of the matter is, even though when Madison goes before Congress and asks for a declaration of war, he does it for those reasons, the fact of the matter is New England opposes the war. And New England, Massachusetts specifically, but also Connecticut and Vermont and other New England states, are guilty during the War of 1812 of behavior that would easily fall under the heading of treason. And in 1814, the New England states call a conference at Hartford, Connecticut, for the express purpose of talking about secession from the Union. Nullification, but even more than that, withdrawing from the Union based on the idea of compact. I'm looking at a wonderful book written by Forrest McDonald, who's one of America's premier constitutional scholars. And it's a little paperback, the title of which is States' Rights and the Union, 1776 to 1876. And McDonald is looking at the whole issue of states' rights through the nation's history. And one of the things that becomes very clear is that it's not just the South that claims states' rights. When the federal government is pursuing policies that any section or any state finds offensive, they fall into the states' rights argument that the South is going to fall into later on. And so lo and behold, when the Hartford Convention is called, and New England has done everything that it can do to not support the war, the Secretary of War at the time, James Monroe, who's going to be president when Madison leaves, Monroe proposes that the way that the United States meet its manpower needs if New England won't support the war is to initiate the draft, conscription. In other words, we'll just draft people, go right over the heads of the states and draft people into the army to fight the war. And in Massachusetts, the very famous Daniel Webster goes nuts over this. He reacts with horror at the idea that the government is going to go in and take our citizens and enroll them in a war that we want no part of. Webster says, "Is this, sir, consistent with the character of a free government? Is this civil liberty? Is this the real character of our Constitution? No, sir, indeed it is not. Where is it written in the Constitution that you may take children from their parents and parents from their children and compel them to fight the battles of any war in which the folly or the wickedness of government may engage it?" Now, while that's a beautifully written speech, the fact of the matter is this is Daniel Webster, who in American history is considered to be the premier architect of speeches honoring and respecting patriotism and American nationalism. But in this particular period, because of the policies coming out of the federal government, Webster reverts clearly to a states' rights position. He concludes his speech by saying, "It will be the solemn duty of the state governments to protect their own authority over their own militia and to interpose between their citizens and arbitrary power. These are among the objects for which the state governments exist, and their highest obligations bind them to the preservation of their own rights and the liberties of their people." So here's Daniel Webster arguing for the rights of the states to interpose themselves between the federal government and the citizens of that state so that the federal government cannot implement policies which these states believe are unconstitutional and unjust and unfair and exceed the legitimate constitutional powers of the government. This is not the South arguing for states' rights. This is New England. This is Massachusetts. And the Hartford Convention is called a convention of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and local conventions from Vermont and New Hampshire. And the assumption widely held was that the convention would propose secession and the creation of a New England Union separate from the United States. What this suggests is how popular this argument is. Whenever you find a national policy that you oppose, you go to the well and you dredge up the same arguments, whether in fact these arguments have been, have since the Civil War been put to rest. It's obvious that Cuccinelli and Rand Paul and the rest of them do not believe it has. And so we're hearing secession talk in many of the southern states, in Texas and many of these other places, about ways to oppose Obamacare, the president's health care plan is through and now Ron Paul's talking about the rights of the states to nullify Obamacare, to declare it null and void within their own states. And we're at the top of our hour, so I'm going to stop in a moment, but I just want to share a couple of the other things that Ron Paul says in that speech. He takes on many of the issues which many of us have heard about. He tore into the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which, if you remember, the 17th Amendment is the one that allows for the direct election of United States senators by popular vote. That undermined the principal importance of the states, Ron Paul said. You may also remember that abolition of the 17th Amendment and the return of power to the states was one of the liberty amendments that we looked at when we went through the liberty amendments in previous weeks. We've been focusing on that. He also criticized the 16th Amendment, which allowed the federal income tax. And basically to suggest that we abolish the 17th Amendment, we abolish the 16th Amendment, and that we nullify Obamacare. I mean, this stuff is bizarre. We'll pick it up when we come back, because there's one other issue here that I really do want to touch on before we get back into the Federalist Papers, because I think that this stuff is incredibly important. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien, and after a 5-minute break, we'll be right back and we'll pursue this with our second hour. Please stay with us. Thank you for tuning in, and hang in. We'll be back in 4 or 5 minutes. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to the second hour of today's program here at the Virtual Center. If you are just joining us, welcome to today's program. If you've been with us through the first hour, we thank you for staying with us. Our phone number, if you would like to participate actively in our program, area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to communicate your thoughts directly to me through an email, I'd be glad to answer it. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906. O'Brien is I-E-N, not I-A-N, I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. If you're just joining us, we were looking at, principally we were looking at the origins of the idea of nullification, the nature of the Union, and what prompted this was a speech that Ron Paul delivered in Richmond, Virginia on Monday evening in support of the election of the Republican candidate, the candidate supported by the Tea Party, who is Ken Cuccinelli, and the election is happening today in Virginia. It's one of two major elections today at the state level. The other one's in New Jersey. Governor Chris Christie is running for re-election. And so the nation is watching these two elections for a lot of reasons. I think we'll see this evening that the media will be all over these two elections. And the predictions were that the Democrat in Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, would probably defeat Cuccinelli easily because of the backlash in Virginia to the shutdown, to the government shutdown, and to sequestration. since Virginia probably has more federal employees who were directly affected by the shutdown than anybody else. The assumption was that the opposition to the Republicans this would be the first opportunity for people to express their opposition to the shutdown in a major election, which included a Republican candidate. The reports today are that the election seems to be a little bit closer than is predicted. So, if Cuccinelli were to win that, it's going to be very significant. And of course, if Terry McAuliffe wins it and Cuccinelli is defeated, then that also will be very significant. But what we've been talking about is the speech that Ron Paul gave in Richmond, Virginia, Monday night, in support of Cuccinelli's candidacy, in which he suggested that states seriously consider the option of nullifying Obamacare, of just declaring Obama's affordable health care plan null and void in their states. And then he began to rant and talk about a number of issues. He jumped about abolishing the 17th Amendment and the 16th Amendment. And, of course, he picks, and you couldn't imagine a speech like this without reference to the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms. And Ron Paul said the Second Amendment is not there so that you can shoot rabbits. Right now, today, we have a great threat to our liberties internally. And then later on in the speech, he goes back to the Second Amendment again, and he says that the constitutional right to keep and bear arms was not for hunting, but to allow rebellion against tyrannical governments. I would suggest to you that's blatantly not true. I mean, I think we've got to begin calling a spade here. There's no way in the world that James Madison and the architects of the Bill of Rights of the United States would put into it an amendment asserting the constitutional right to keep and bear arms so that people could rebel against their own government. I mean, that makes no sense. But they continue to say it. I would suggest to you that the point, an additional point that I think needs to be made here is if these things were resolved, were fought out in the 19th century, if Calhoun's brilliant case for nullification, read Calhoun's Fort Hill address, which is his explanation, his rationale for the right of the states to nullify federal laws within their own states. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. Not only is it brilliant for the substance it contains, but the tone and the strategy of the position is brilliant as well. Calhoun almost apologizes for the fact that he's got to say this, because he points to his own career. He was one of the biggest nationalists in the first 15 or 20 years of the 19th century that we had. There was nobody any more nationalist in support of the power and strength of the federal government and the nation than Calhoun and Clay. Clay with his economic system called the American system, and Calhoun with his support for a strong military, for West Point, his support of a strong Navy, and of a viable, powerful military budget, and all the rest of it. And in his speech on nullification, Calhoun goes back to all of that and says, I was the biggest nationalist of all. I'm the one. I made speeches. I did such and such. And it pains me to have to point this out. But what he's pointing out is it's the government's fault for undertaking policies and programs which are so patently unfair and unconstitutional as he points out, as these tariffs are. So he is able to get through the South Carolina legislature a nullification act where South Carolina nullifies the federal tariff of 1832, which Andrew Jackson, the president, interprets as a declaration of war. Andrew Jackson goes crazy and said basically nullification of this tariff in the state of South Carolina is virtually a declaration of war against the United States. So the word has it, the sources indicate that Jackson was parading up and down in the White House saying, if Calhoun wants a war, damn it, he'll get a war. And he's telling his advisors, go have them bring me a force bill. Bring me an act where we will basically raise a federal army and I will send federal troops into South Carolina. And then he said, you got to give your opponents an out. So he said, find a substitute, a compromise tariff bill. And Jackson makes the points in one of his papers, and said they're all over the place. Everybody has a compromise tariff bill. Have to tell them, just pick one. Doesn't matter which one, but we got to find a way to pull the plug in this, because I will go to war against South Carolina. That's how abrasive and how much of a challenge to federal power the federal government saw nullification. And here's Ron Paul in Richmond, Virginia in 2013, in the month of Thanksgiving. That's kind of a shot, I guess. Advocating nullification of the Affordable Health Care Act, nullifying a law whose purpose is to bring health care to people that don't have it. Think about that. If Andrew Jackson was president of the United States, this would be effectively a declaration of war. These statements are treasonable. I mean, they're advocating armed rebellion against, the purpose of the Second Amendment is not for hunting, but to allow rebellion against tyrannical government. The founders wanted to put in the Second Amendment the right to pick up arms against your own government. This would be one of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution written and selected by James Madison, who wrote the Constitution of the United States. This doesn't make sense at all. And this is the final point that I wanted to make on what we were talking about in the first hour. What causes this? Why do people continue to go back to the same well and dredge up the same arguments, etc.? And I'm suggesting very strongly that the reason they do this is because they believe that the bulk of the people in the United States will believe anything. This is what frightens me as much as this is one of the reasons why I wanted so badly to have something like the virtual center, where we could look at some of this stuff and get an accurate picture of what's really going on. What we are seeing in America, I feel, are people who are playing fast and loose with the truth. Rand Paul, the son of Ron Paul, has been found guilty of plagiarism on more than several occasions. And according to a report that I read in today's Washington Post, he kind of recanted and said, we won't do this anymore, but he didn't apologize because he's bitter. The tone of this article suggested that Rand Paul was bitter because he'd been called on this. And his position seemed to be, the details don't matter. It's the principle here that counts. What I'm saying is important. How I say it is immaterial. If I take it from somebody else, from Wikipedia, from somebody else, it doesn't make any difference. In other words, these people are taking on principles and truths and moral positions that this nation has subscribed to for generations, and playing fast and loose with them and openly trashing them. This idea of nullifying the Affordable Care Act, the reason that they do this is because they feel that it's going to appeal to people who are confused about or uncertain about or even angry at the federal government for what's happening in the area of health care or what's not happening. A website that doesn't work, and on and on and on. We're talking about all of this. So this is a very popular political argument. The fact that it's dangerous, it's resorting to an argument that we have fought a war over, is frightening, because what's driving it is a basic sense that the American people will believe anything. They know so little about their nation's history that they'll believe anything. And so what you do is you conjure up the names of Jefferson and Madison and all these people, and you pull them in and you misquote them. You blatantly attribute positions to them which are totally contradictory to the truth. You play fast and loose with the truth, and if you're caught on it, you attack your accuser. You express anger that you were caught because it's an effort to divert. I mentioned yesterday, divert attention. I mentioned yesterday that in all of the debates about the problems with the website, which was supposed to be up and running as of October 1st, so now we're more than a month into it and the thing still isn't working the way it was supposed to. And what I suggested is that I hadn't really seen anything about sabotage. That it just seemed to me that people were so upset about the Affordable Health Care Act. There was so much hatred toward Obama and towards his legislation and towards this particular piece of legislation that it seemed to me very logical that there would be an opportunity in here for sabotage, especially the website. Anything this complicated, this complex, is ripe for sabotage. So today I happen to note two articles which talked about this. The extent to which the opponents of the Affordable Care Act have been instrumental in making sure that this website didn't work. That it almost suggests a conspiracy against the implementation of the program. And it's specifically Jonathan Capehart in this morning's Washington Post specifically attributes the problems with the website to Republican opponents of the Affordable Care Act in Congress. And what they have done is they've underfunded it, but they've also engaged in active political campaigns to encourage young people, healthy people, to not sign up for it, and to encourage state governments that Republicans control to not set up the exchanges, the health insurance exchanges that the Act calls for. In other words, calling on states to voluntarily refuse to participate in the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And the fact of the matter is, it was the Supreme Court of the United States that created that loophole. John Roberts, when he ruled last year on the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, basically in his decision created an opportunity for opponents of the act by suggesting that states could voluntarily opt out of implementation of the act. In other words, a state could voluntarily decide not to participate. It could reject all of this federal health care money if it chose to. And of course, as we know, 26 states have refused to participate in the Affordable Care Act. And the way the act is written, if your state does not set up an insurance exchange, and of course the exchange is once you fill out the appropriate paperwork and are registered, then you have an opportunity to input your health needs, and various companies are allowed to compete for your business, to write you a policy. And the idea is that the competition between these companies for your business is going to bring down the costs of health insurance. The backup, of course, is that, in case, because of the loophole where states didn't have to participate, the assumption was that there would be a few states that refused to buy in, where opposition to the Affordable Care Act was strongest. And in those cases, citizens could connect with the federal exchange. The federal government would have its own exchange program of insurance policy options. Well, the fact of the matter is when 26 of the 50 states opted out of the program, that meant that citizens from 46 states suddenly began to overwhelm the federal exchange website. And there was no way in the world that the website was created and prepared to handle that kind of traffic. That's the first thing. The second thing is that while all of this is going on, Republicans in Congress are doing everything they can to underfund the Affordable Care Act. So they refused funding for the federal exchange, given the amount of traffic that it's going to have to handle. So by denying the implementation funds, they have effectively engaged in a dual strategy, which has created this disaster called the Affordable Health Care website. And the administration is scurrying around trying to rationalize and justify the fact that it doesn't work. And what happens? Tom Friedman made the point in an article he wrote over the weekend that, sure, 5 million people tried to get on the federal website, and it didn't work. It crashed. But then he points out there are 48 million Indonesians on Facebook. 48 million on Facebook. The reality being, if all of these other operations can put up websites, why can't the government under the Affordable Care Act? So in a sense, a combination of strategies and programs and policies has consciously set out to defeat the Obama health care program. And given the fact that it's the law of the land, and given the fact that members of Congress take an oath to support the Constitution and the laws of the United States, then one has to raise questions as to whether, in fact, there are legal issues here. There is violations of the constitutional oath of members of the Republican Party in Congress here. There's serious issues going on. But the fact of the matter is the issues are so complex and so confusing that the average person, the average citizen, can't figure them out. And I would suggest this idea of resorting to nullification is a classic example of believing that if you make the case strong enough and you scream it loud enough and frequently enough, the people will buy anything, because they really don't know what's happening. Part of it is the complexity of the issues themselves. But I would suggest to you part of it is the nature of the education system in this country and the whole idea of citizenship education specifically. We have a lot of people that are depending on people with a political agenda to get their information. I wish I had $1 for everybody who told me that they don't listen to anything else but Fox News. I get all my news from Fox News, and it just frightens me to death. Because I know progressive friends who say, I go to MSNBC. And the fact of the matter is, if we could get some of those people to go to the other place, we probably have much better informed people. But be that as it may. Anyway, I think this is a particular issue. It's a very important one because it raises serious questions about the Constitution of the United States. And let me raise one more issue before we leave this. I want to read you from an article that appeared during the Hartford Convention in 1814. This is an article that appeared in the Boston Gazette in 1814 at the time of the Hartford Convention, which presumably was going to deal with the issue of New England seceding from the Union and setting up its own separate union. And the article reads as follows: "The Hartford Convention can, if they should think proper, take for their example and the basis of their proceedings the results of the Convention of 1788, of which the revered Washington was president, and form a new frame of government." Unquote. The Hartford Convention, if the people running it should think proper, can take their example from the Convention of 1788. And of course, what I think that means the Convention of 1787, which is the Constitutional Convention, of which the revered Washington was president, and form a new frame of government. That frame should be then submitted to the legislatures of the several states for their approbation and adoption. And as was the case at that time, this new Constitution can go into operation as soon as 2, 3, 4, 5, or any other number of states that may be named shall have adopted it. Unquote. The Constitution of the United States was ratified, according to the Constitution, would become the law of the land when ratified by 9 of the 13 states. It was replacing the Articles of Confederation, which required that in order to amend the Articles, all 13 states had to agree. The Constitutional Convention arbitrarily chooses 9. Here, in 1814, which is 30-some-odd years after the Constitutional Convention, here's an article in a Boston newspaper talking about the fact that the Hartford Convention ought to model itself after the Constitutional Convention. Sure, you can secede from the Union. The members of the convention can choose to do that. But hell, why not just change the system? Why not just use the convention as an opportunity to create a new constitution? And then decide that if it's approved by 2 states or 3 states or 4 states or 5 states or 10 states, it doesn't matter. It becomes the law of the land. That's what we did before. Why not do it again? That's how unbelievably close and how unbelievably dangerous this kind of a situation can become. I go back to Mark Levin's book on the Liberty Amendments, and specifically his expressed intent to get enough states to call for a constitutional convention as a way to take care of Obamacare and all the other problems that the nation faces. Get rid of the 17th Amendment, allow popular recall of the Supreme Court, give the election of United States senators back to the state legislatures, rebuild the power and the integrity of the states, reduce the power of the election process, pass a constitutional amendment committing the nation to free enterprise. Why not? We did it before. I am suggesting that what we talked about here at the Virtual Center when we looked at the Liberty Amendments, at Mark Levin's book on the Liberty Amendments, we are talking about something that is a threat that is very, very real. To me, it's a red flag when Ron Paul goes into Richmond, Virginia, and starts talking about abolishing the 17th Amendment, because that's one of Mark Levin's. What we're talking about here is a right-wing League of Friendship. And the document that holds them all together is a document outlining these Liberty Amendments, which becomes the agenda for what a new constitutional convention would do to change the nation the way these people believe it ought to be changed. And the fact that so many states opted out of Obamacare, and the fact that we're talking here nullification and civil war and taking up arms against a tyrannical government and all of these things in the year 2013, the situation at the ballot box in these elections is so sensitive and so significant right now that if there's enough popular sentiment against Obamacare and against the federal government for even trying to do it, Ron Paul says in his speech Monday night that the next thing they're going to do is not just tell you which doctor you can go to and which one you're not. They're going to require people to eat asparagus. They're going to require people to buy cars only from General Motors. They're going to, and then Cuccinelli made the point and said, I drive an Equinox. You don't want an Equinox. And on and on and on. So I find this paragraph, this letter out of the Boston Gazette in 1814 about writing a new constitution while we have everybody at Hartford as being very significant and very relevant to what's going on in America today. I think more and more that the Liberty Amendments, Mark Levin's book, becomes more and more revealing. And it kind of suggests when Ron Paul comes out of retirement and travels to Richmond, Virginia to make a speech and talks about abolishing the 17th Amendment, and that happens to be one of the amendments that Mark Levin's talking about, and Rush Limbaugh's talking about these things, and Glenn Beck is talking about these things, and on and on and on. What we're suggesting is that there's a game plan. There's an agenda. It's already on the table. It's already been agreed to. All that's necessary is the opportunity. And the chaos that we are witnessing surrounding these elections and this affordable health care plan, I think, is incredibly significant because it's potentially the occasion that is liable to push the desire for a constitutional convention over the line. There's a possibility. There's 26 states that have opted out of Obamacare right now. 34 states of the 50 would constitute the two-thirds necessary to call a constitutional convention. And we have all these elections coming up in all of these other states. And so what's going on is critical. And the fact that these people are basing their entire strategy on the gullibility and the ignorance of the American people is frightening. I believe, I've said this before and I don't want to use this as a pulpit, but I believe it's absolutely vital that the Head On Radio Network and the people who listen to it and the people who speak on it be kept on the air. We have got to basically keep this position out there. We've got to find ways to inform more and more people of what's happening. Because the relative ignorance of the American people is frightening. The fact that most people assume that nullification in states' rights is something only applies to the South prior to the Civil War is just not true. And I think the situation of the Hartford Convention in 1814, taking issue with Madison's War of 1812, which they sarcastically referred to as Mr. Madison's War. How significant is that? Mr. Madison's War, Mr. Obama's health care plan. Think about that. We don't talk about Mr. Roosevelt's Social Security. We don't talk about Lyndon Johnson's Medicare program. But we talk about Obama's health care program. Who talks about it? The people that are violently opposed to it. The same people that made reference to the War of 1812 as Mr. Madison's war. That's part of the political rhetoric and the tone that sets the stage for opposition to it and for a mass popular opinion appeal for supporters. And that's what's going on right now. I think it's very, very important. We are at 40 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 20 minutes to go in our program, and I'd like to return to the Federalist Papers and get back into the issues and the explanations related to the Constitution of the United States. I want to just refer back again briefly to Federalist 39, Federalist 39, which we looked at yesterday in our second hour. And specifically, I want to return to a couple of conclusions we drew. It would stand to reason that the answer to this question about nullification, or interposition if you want to use that term, the right of the states to interpose themselves between the federal government and the citizens of that state, or the right of the state to out-nullify, which means declare null and void a particular piece of federal legislation within that state, it would stand to reason that the place to go, or a place to go, to find out whether in fact this stuff is valid or not would be the Federalist Papers. What is Madison wrote them? He's the architect of the Constitution. He's the guru. He's the expert. What does he say about Republican government, about the right of the people to take up arms against a tyrannical government? What does Madison say? Well, we looked yesterday at what Madison said about Republican government. And the fact of the matter is, if you can figure out what he said about Republican government, you're a better person than I am. Because we read enough text out of Federalist 39 yesterday, I would suggest, to make the point that these issues are so muddy and so complex and so vague that understanding them clearly pretty much defies the intelligence of most pretty well-educated people, let alone the masses of the people. And I refer you thinking back to Otto's letter to Vergennes in 1786, where Otto talked about documents and position papers coming from the pens of the leadership of the wealthy and powerful that were designed to obfuscate the truth. Position papers that were full of what he called circumlocutions, which the people would find it very, very difficult to figure out, but which the few and the powerful, the wealthy and the powerful, would understand quite well. And I believe that a classic example of that strategy in action is Federalist number 39. When Madison takes on the issue of republicanism, Republican government, and in the opening line of Federalist number 39, Madison makes the point that if you were to ask people what the character or what constitutes Republican government, you'd get as many different answers as people you asked. And then he went through and looked at Holland and Poland and Venice and England as but 4 examples of governments that are so different in the way they organized and the way they function, yet every one of them refers to itself as a republic. So his conclusion then is that it's not possible to accurately and precisely define the character of Republican government. In 1842, a case comes before the Supreme Court of the United States, and across the desk of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, based a case which began or came from Rhode Island, and it was a challenge to the government of Rhode Island as a violation of the constitutional provision which commits the central government, the federal government, to guarantee to each state a republican form of government. And the position of those who make the case is that the people of Rhode Island are being denied access to Republican government, and that the federal government has a responsibility to guarantee them that access. And therefore, it seeks relief from the Supreme Court of the United States. And Roger B. Taney makes the point that the ingredients, the specific details of Republican government are a political issue, not a judicial one. In other words, in order to find out which of these two competing governments in Rhode Island is truly Republican, it's necessary to go to the legislature, to the lawmakers, for the answer to that, not the courts. What Roger B. Taney is doing effectively is washing his hands, denying the chance to specifically define the ingredients of Republican government. Basically, what he's saying is Republican government can mean different things to different people, which is kind of what Madison says in Federalist number 39. And so, in a sense, the Supreme Court kicks the can down the road by refusing to define the ingredients of republicanism. They leave it up to the legislative branch of government to do that. Obviously, if the Supreme Court had taken the challenge, had taken the bait, and established a set of specific criteria which define Republican government, then we would have something hard and fast to use as a barometer against which to measure the Constitution of the United States. But we don't have it. So consequently, Republican government seems to be whatever those who are in control say it is. And as Madison says, the only thing a Republican government must have is a certain form. It should have separation of powers. The people, the entire body of the people, needs to participate in the creation of the of the government. And then he points out that within the Constitution of the United States, some of it's federal, some of it's national. So you can't really say, as the anti-federalist opponents of the Constitution are arguing, that the Constitution of the United States supplants the Confederation with a consolidated government, a national system. Madison goes through and points out some of it's national, but some of it remains federal. For example, the people choose members of the House of Representatives. That's Republican. But on the other hand, state legislatures elect the Senate. That's a concession to the states. So that's federal. And Madison goes back and forth between national and federal enough times that he makes the point that the Constitution of the United States has a little bit of this and a little bit of that and some of this and some of that. So therefore, its opponents are merely blowing in the wind when they say that this new system will replace this with that. The system is designed, the Constitution is designed so brilliantly, and it is so complex that it becomes impossible to really nail down anything specific about it. And I believe, and this is my point, I believe that this is not an accident. This is the way you get the Constitution ratified. This is an example of the circumlocutions and the obfuscations that are associated with creating a political system in a republic where you have the masses of the people participating in a system that they cannot figure out. They really cannot understand. So therefore, they become dependent on those who do know to tell them what they need to know. And what Madison and the Federalists are doing is telling them why we need this system. And it's successful. It works. And I think it is absolutely brilliant. I think the quality, the caliber of writing, and the depth of analysis that exists is fantastic. Where I want to go tomorrow, when we get together here at the Virtual Center, is I wanted to look at those Federalist Papers that deal specifically with the idea of the structure and the operation of the political system created under the Constitution. The idea from the Confederation period that power in a republic tends naturally to flow to the legislative branch, to the people's branch. Since it is popular government, since it is based on mass participation, it stands to reason that power in what was happening at states level, and that's really created the problems, prompted the calling of the Constitutional Convention in the first place. So I think those issues are incredibly important. And what Madison does is, in Federalist number 47, he goes through every one of the state constitutions, all 13 states, and he points out aspects of each state constitution which raise questions as to how Republican that state constitution really is. Once again, he's engaged in refuting the positions and the arguments of the anti-federalists. Again, taking on the major position that the Confederation supported Republican governments, but that the Constitution of the United States does not. And the way Madison goes about dealing with that is to go into each state constitution and point out that there are non-republics of every single state constitution. What he is effectively doing then is making the case that these people are not on solid ground to claim a commitment to Republican government, because the fact of the matter is every one of the existing state constitutions, all 13 of them, violates republicanism one way or another. So in a sense, what he's doing as part of his effort to refute the position of the critics of the Constitution is to challenge the Republican governments that they are relying on and that they are arguing being displaced by the Constitution of the States. It's a brilliant strategy. And Federalist number 47 does. And then in Federalist number 48, Madison goes to two of them for specific detail and example of the tendency of popular governments to put more power in the people's hands than Republican government can have if it's going to work. He's talking about the danger that Republican governments tend to end up giving more power to the legislative branch than anything else. Now, of course, that was the intent behind the Confederation period, was to trust the legislatures. They didn't trust the governors because basically most of the problem they had with the colonies, when the colonies, the states were colonies of Great Britain, most of the trouble they had was with Britain's royal governors. So it stands to reason that when they wrote their own constitutions, they would concentrate on reducing the power of the governor and enhancing the power of the legislature, which fit their model and was very, very rational in light of what they were challenging from their status as colonies. In other words, England, the mother country, tended to disband or to ignore the legislatures and to rely on the absolute power of the governors. So naturally, when the colonies become independent states and write their own constitutions, they're going to reverse that formula. They're going to find ways to give power to the legislative branch and do everything they can to minimize the power of the government. And with only a few exceptions, most state constitutions don't even have a separate judiciary. What they expect is that the legislature will appoint people with legal minds who are members of the legislature to sit as a subcommittee and act as a judicial branch and make judicial renderings, judicial decisions based on certain key aspects of the law. So in a sense, the very success of Republican governments under the Confederation, which is power in the people's branch, to Madison and the other Federalists is the reason why the Articles of Confederation had to be scrapped and a whole new system of government created, which would put power where it needs to be. And that's basically Madison's position in 47. And what we'll see tomorrow is that his major source for that is Virginia and Pennsylvania. He uses those two states for examples of an excess of power in the hands of legislatures. And in Virginia specifically, he quotes Thomas Jefferson from his notes, Jefferson's notes on Virginia. It's a beautiful quotation about the nature of the Virginia Constitution of 1776. It's beautiful. We are at 58 minutes after the hour, and I think our time here at the Virtual Center is just about up today. And I thought I'd give you a preview of these Federalist Papers that we'll go into tomorrow, because we had so little time it wasn't possible to get into them. I guess we spent a little bit too much time on nullification and Ron Paul. But I guess that's what we need to do, and we aim to do what we need to do. Thank you for listening to today's program. I'm Bill O'Brien. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. And if you leave here today with one question or one thing to focus upon, I would ask you to seriously consider the issue of civic responsibility. Given what we've talked about today, where does civic responsibility lie? What seems to have happened to it? I think that's a serious question. We'll take it up as we go on. I'm Bill O'Brien. Thank you for listening. Be safe, and we'll be back together again tomorrow. Thank you.